I thought I understood my family better than anyone else. After all, I had spent my life watching them grow, learning their habits, forgiving their flaws before they even noticed them. That evening began like so many others. The table was set neatly, the food still warm, the room filled with familiar voices. I sat in my usual place, quietly observing, believing that being together was enough. The first sharp word sounded almost harmless. A comment about expenses said with a tired voice. Another followed, louder, impatient. I felt the air change. Conversations overlapped, voices rose, and what should have been a simple dinner slowly turned into something tense and uncomfortable. I kept my eyes on my plate, hoping the moment would pass. Then the argument found its true direction. Decisions were mentioned, plans about the house, about the future, about what would supposedly make things easier. My name was spoken, but no one looked at me. They talked as if I were not sitting right there, as if my thoughts no longer mattered. I waited, expecting someone to ask for my opinion. No one did. I tried to speak gently at first. My words were cut off almost immediately. Someone said I worried too much. Another voice told me not to make things complicated. I felt small, embarrassed for even trying. I folded my hands together, reminding myself how often I had stayed silent to keep peace. When the argument ended, it ended suddenly. Chairs scraped back, plates were left untouched, and everyone drifted away as if nothing important had happened. I remained at the table alone, staring at the empty chairs. That was when it became clear to me. This was not just a disagreement. It was the moment I realized I had slowly disappeared from my own family's conversations. I did not expect the silence to last, but it did. After that evening, the house felt different, as if it had learned to breathe more quietly. I moved through the room slowly, careful not to disturb anyone, though no one had asked me to be careful. The kitchen, once my safest place, felt empty even when it was full of people. I washed dishes alone, listening for footsteps that never came. At night, sleep avoided me. I replayed the argument again and again, wondering where I had gone wrong. Maybe I should have spoken louder. Maybe I should have stayed completely silent. Doubt has a way of growing in the dark, and I let it. I told myself that families argue, that this was normal, that things would return to how they were. Deep down, I already knew they would not. Mornings became polite and distant. Short greetings replaced conversations. Someone would ask if I needed anything, but the question felt rehearsed, empty of real concern. They discussed plans in low voices, stopping the moment I entered the room. I smiled, pretending not to notice, pretending it did not hurt. One afternoon, as I passed the hallway, I overheard them talking again. They spoke about changes, about arrangements, about what would be easier for everyone. My name was mentioned carefully, like a fragile object. I stood still, my hand resting against the wall, feeling the truth settle in my chest. The argument at the table had not been the beginning. It had been a test. And the silence that followed was their decision. They were moving forward, and I was no longer meant to walk beside them. I started paying closer attention after that. When you feel yourself being pushed aside, you notice details you once ignored. I noticed how often they checked their phones while I was speaking, how quickly conversations changed when I entered the room. I noticed how decisions were announced to me, never discussed. Always calmly. Always for the best. One evening, I finally asked a simple question. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse anyone. I only asked why no one talked to me anymore the way they used to. The room went quiet in an uncomfortable way. Someone sighed. Someone said I was imagining things. Another voice told me I should be grateful that they were taking care of everything. That word stayed with me, grateful. As if my place in the family had shifted from being a part of it to being a responsibility. I felt something tighten inside my chest, but I nodded because that was easier than arguing. I had spent a lifetime choosing peace over truth. Later that night, I sat alone in my room, surrounded by photographs from another time. Smiling faces, arms around shoulders, proof that I had once been needed, not managed. I wondered when love had turned into obligation, and when care had started to feel like control. The next day brought another small shock. I was told about plans that involved my things, my space, my routine. Everything was spoken gently, kindly, as if kindness could replace consent. I listened without interrupting, feeling myself fade a little more with every sentence. That was when I understood something clearly for the first time. They were not trying to hurt me. They simply believed I no longer had the right to choose. And that realization hurt more than any argument ever could. The idea was mentioned casually, almost carelessly, as if it were nothing more than a suggestion. We were sitting in the living room, the television on, but no one really watching. Someone said it would be easier if I didn't have to worry about the house anymore. Another voice added that I deserved rest. They spoke softly, kindly, choosing their words the way people do when they are certain they are right. I listened, nodding slowly, while my heart beat louder with every sentence. They talked about selling the house. My house. The place where I had measured the children's height on the doorframe. Where I had cried quietly in the kitchen. Where every corner carried a memory I had never shared. They said it was too much responsibility for me now. Too big. Too old. I asked where I would go. The question hung in the air longer than it should have. Finally, someone smiled and said they would figure it out. That I wouldn't be alone. That everything would be taken care of. Their reassurance felt heavy, like a door closing gently but firmly. I looked around the room at the furniture chosen long ago, at the windows I cleaned every spring, at the walls that had heard my prayers and my anger. No one looked back at me. They were already imagining a future that did not include my voice. In that moment, I understood something painful and clear. They did not see this house as my life. They saw it as a problem to solve. And for the first time, fear mixed with something new inside me. A quiet resistance. I realized that if I stayed silent now, I might lose more than a home. I might lose myself. That night, I walked through the house long after everyone had gone to bed. I moved slowly, touching familiar surfaces as if to make sure they were still real. The hallway wall still held the faint marks where children once ran their hands along it. The kitchen window still faced the yard where laughter had filled the summers. Each room carried a piece of me, even if no one else noticed. I stopped in front of an old cabinet and opened the bottom drawer, the one no one ever used. Inside were papers, letters, and small objects I had kept without thinking much about them. Things that never seemed important enough to explain, yet too meaningful to throw away. I sat on the floor and began to look through them, feeling a strange calm settle over me. There were notes written in hurried handwriting, reminders of promises made and forgotten, documents with my name signed carefully at the bottom, proof of choices I had made on my own, long before anyone decided I could no longer do so. I realized how little they truly knew about my past, about the strength I once carried without help. As dawn approached, I folded everything back into the drawer and closed it gently. I did not feel weak. I felt awake. The fear was still there, but it no longer controlled me. I understood that silence had protected others, not me. When morning came, I sat at the table waiting, not with anger but with clarity. Whatever conversation was coming next, I knew one thing for certain. This time, I would not let my life be discussed as if I were not in the room. They noticed something was different that morning. I could see it in the way they looked at me, as if they were trying to read my face before speaking. The table was quieter than usual. Cups were placed carefully, chairs pulled out gently. No one rushed. They were waiting for me to say something first, and that alone felt unfamiliar. I did not begin with accusations. I spoke slowly, choosing words the way one chooses steps on thin ice. I said I wanted to understand what plans were being made for my life. I asked why those conversations had happened without me. My voice did not shake, but my hands did. I kept them folded together so no one would notice. The response came quickly. They said I misunderstood. They said they were only trying to help. Someone reminded me of my age, of how tiring it must be to manage everything alone. Another voice said change was necessary whether I liked it or not. Their words were calm, reasonable, almost gentle. That made them harder to argue with. I felt a familiar urge to retreat, to apologize for speaking at all. For a moment I almost did. Then I remembered the drawer, the papers, the life I had lived before being reduced to a concern. I lifted my eyes and said something I had never said before. I told them I was still capable of deciding for myself. The room went quiet again. But this silence was different. It was tense, uncertain. I realized then that my resistance frightened them more than my silence ever had. And once they saw I was no longer willing to disappear quietly, there was no turning back. The days after that conversation felt uneasy, like walking on a floor that might crack at any moment. No one raised their voice, yet every word seemed careful, measured. I could sense their frustration hiding behind politeness. They were not used to me pushing back, and I was not used to seeing confusion in their eyes. I noticed small changes. Doors closed more often. Conversations stopped when I entered the room, then resumed awkwardly. Someone suggested giving me more rest, as if my words had proven their point instead of challenging it. I listened without interrupting, storing every moment quietly inside me. One afternoon, I was asked to sit down for another talk. This time they spoke about responsibility, about safety, about how families must sometimes make difficult choices. They used soft voices again, but the meaning was sharp. They believed they knew better because they were younger, stronger, more modern. I asked a simple question that surprised even me. I asked if any of them remembered who had kept this family together when things were hard, who had sacrificed without being asked. The room grew still. No one answered right away. Memory can be uncomfortable when it interrupts confidence. Later, alone in my room, I felt both exhausted and steady. Standing up for myself had cost me something, but it had also given me something back. I understood now that this conflict was no longer about a house or decisions. It was about whether I was still allowed to be seen as a person, not a burden. That evening, I found myself sitting with an old photo album on my lap. I had not opened it in years. The pages were thick and yellowed, the corners worn from being touched too often long ago. I turned them slowly, stopping at faces frozen in moments that felt both close and distant. There I was, younger, standing proudly in front of the same house they now wanted to sell. As I looked at those photographs, I remembered times when I had been the one making impossible decisions, when money was scarce, when fear lived in the corners of every day. No one had stepped in then to take care of everything. I had done it myself quietly because there was no other choice. That strength had not disappeared. It had only been forgotten. Later, someone came into the room and noticed the album. They smiled softly and said it was good for me to remember the past. The words stung more than they meant to. Remembering was not my problem. Being dismissed was. I closed the album without answering. That night, I made a small decision of my own. I gathered important documents and placed them together in one folder. I wrote down phone numbers I had not used in years. Old friends, distant relatives, people who still knew me as more than a concern. I did not know exactly what I would do next, but for the first time in a long while I felt prepared. Whatever was coming, I would meet it standing, not sitting quietly in the background. The tension in the house slowly turned into something else. Not open conflict but distance. We moved around each other like strangers sharing the same space. Kind words were exchanged, but warmth was missing. I realized how easy it is for a family to look peaceful while breaking apart inside. One morning, I overheard a phone call that confirmed my fears. They were discussing timelines, appointments, and next steps. Everything sounded organized, efficient. My name appeared again, carefully wrapped in concern. I stood in the doorway unseen, feeling a familiar mix of anger and sadness rise within me. Later that day, I asked directly what they were planning. The answer came with hesitation. They said they were only preparing just in case. Just in case I became too tired. Just in case things became difficult. I listened, nodding slowly, recognizing the pattern. Decisions made early become decisions enforced later. That evening, I called someone I had not spoken to in a long time. Hearing a familiar voice reminded me who I had been before my world shrank to these walls. We spoke about small things at first, then about larger ones. When I hung up, my hands were shaking, but my mind was clear. I understood then that waiting quietly would only make their choices easier. If I wanted my life to remain mine, I would have to act before everything was settled without me. The next conversation happened sooner than I expected. We sat together again, this time without food, without distractions. They spoke as if everything had already been carefully considered. Options were presented to me like gifts, each one limiting in its own way. Smaller space, fewer responsibilities, more supervision, always more supervision. I listened without interrupting. Their words flowed easily, supported by logic and concern. They said it was temporary. They said it was practical. They said it would give everyone peace of mind. No one asked what would give me peace. When it was my turn to speak, I felt the weight of every silent year behind me. I said I was not ready to leave my home. I said I could still care for myself. My voice was steady, even when theirs was not. For the first time, I saw impatience flash across a familiar face. They reminded me of my age again, of risks, of what might happen if something went wrong. Fear was their strongest argument. I understood it well. I had used it myself once to protect them. Now it was being used against me. That night I realized something important. This was no longer about persuasion. It was about control. And if I allowed fear to decide for me, I would lose more than my home. I would lose the right to choose how my own story continued. After that night, I stopped pretending everything was fine. Not in words, but in the way I carried myself. I no longer rushed to please anyone. I took my time in the mornings, sat by the window longer, allowed silence without trying to fill it. It unsettled them. When a woman who has always adjusted suddenly stops, people feel it immediately. I began doing small things for myself. I went for walks alone, even when they offered to come with me. I chose my own meals. I rearranged a corner of the living room that had not been touched in years. These were not acts of rebellion but reminders, to them and to myself, that I still existed beyond their plans. One afternoon, a comment slipped out that revealed more than they intended. Someone said it would be easier once everything was settled. Once I was somewhere safe. The words were spoken lightly, but they landed heavily. I asked what safe meant. No one answered right away. Safety, I realized, was their way of saying controlled. That evening, I sat alone and thought about all the times I had chosen what was easier for others instead of what was right for me. I had called it love. I had called it sacrifice. Now I saw it clearly. Love should not require disappearance. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a future they had not designed. It frightened me, but it also filled me with a quiet strength. Whatever happened next, I knew I would no longer shrink to make this family comfortable. A few days later, I was told we needed to talk again. The tone was gentle, almost rehearsed. We sat in the same living room, but the atmosphere felt colder. They spoke about concern, about love, about responsibility. Each word was familiar, worn smooth from overuse. I listened carefully, noticing how none of it included what I wanted. Someone finally said it clearly. They believed I could not live alone much longer. They said it was not a judgment, just a reality. I felt something tighten in my chest, but I did not interrupt. I waited until the words were finished, until there was no room left for misunderstanding. Then I spoke. I told them I understood fear. I told them I had lived with it longer than they realized. I reminded them of times when I had managed crises without help, when I had protected them from knowing how close things were to falling apart. My voice was calm, but the truth behind it was heavy. They looked surprised, almost uncomfortable. It is difficult to argue with a past you have forgotten. Someone said things were different now, that the world had changed. I agreed. It had. But I had changed too. When the conversation ended, no agreement had been reached. But something important had happened. For the first time, my resistance was no longer quiet. And they were beginning to understand that I was not going to step aside without being heard. That night, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief because I had finally spoken without apologizing. Sadness because I saw clearly how unfamiliar that version of me was to them. I lay in bed listening to the house settle, the small sounds of pipes and distant traffic, wondering when this place had stopped feeling like home and started feeling like a discussion. The next day, I noticed how carefully they watched me. Every movement, every pause. When I reached for something on a high shelf, someone stood up quickly, ready to help before I asked. When I went outside, a question followed about where I was going. Their concern wrapped around me tightly, like something meant to protect but heavy enough to restrict. I realized then that they were already mourning a version of me that still existed. In their minds, I had become fragile, unpredictable, close to disappearing. It frightened them, and fear makes people act without listening. I understood that, but understanding did not make it fair. That afternoon, I sat down and wrote a list. Simple things. What I could still do. What I needed help with. What I would not give up. Seeing it on paper steadied me. It reminded me that my life was not a problem to be solved, but a balance to be respected. When I folded the paper and placed it beside my bed, I felt calmer. Whatever came next, I would meet it prepared. I was no longer reacting to their plans. I was shaping my own. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. One evening, a visitor arrived, someone from outside the family, invited without asking me. They spoke politely, professionally, using words like options and arrangements. I recognized the tone immediately. It was the voice people use when they believe a decision has already been made. I listened quietly at first, watching familiar faces nod along. They spoke about comfort, about structure, about what would be best for someone my age. I noticed how easily they answered questions meant for me. How naturally my voice was replaced by theirs. It was a scene I had lived before, only now I saw it clearly. When I finally spoke, the room stilled. I said I appreciated the concern, but I had not agreed to any of this. I said I was still capable of deciding where and how I lived. The visitor looked surprised. Someone quickly tried to soften my words, laughing lightly, but it was too late. The truth had been spoken out loud. After the door closed behind the guest, the tension remained. I was told I had embarrassed them, that I should have waited, that there was a proper way to handle such things. I listened, feeling the familiar pull of guilt, but I did not step back. That night, alone again, I realized something important. Speaking up had consequences, but so did staying silent. And for the first time, I was willing to accept the cost of being heard. After that evening, nothing was hidden anymore. The kindness became strained, the patience thinner. I could feel disappointment in the air, like something unspoken but heavy. They moved around me carefully, unsure whether to guide or confront. I was no longer predictable, and that unsettled them. One morning, someone finally said what had been circling for weeks. They accused me of being stubborn, of making things harder than they needed to be. They said I was thinking only of myself. The words were not shouted, but they cut deeply. I wondered how easily a lifetime of giving could be forgotten. I answered quietly. I said that wanting a voice in my own life was not selfish. I said that dignity mattered as much as safety. My words did not convince everyone, but they did not disappear either. They hung between us, demanding to be acknowledged. Later that day, I sat by the window and watched the light shift across the floor. I thought about how often I had taught others to stand up for themselves, even while failing to do so myself. The irony was sharp, but it also gave me strength. I understood then that this conflict had reached its turning point. Whatever happened next would change our family permanently. There would be no return to the quiet obedience they were used to. And strangely, despite the fear, I felt ready for that change. The days that followed felt suspended, as if we were all waiting for something to happen. Conversations were shorter, movements more deliberate. No one mentioned the future anymore, but it lingered in every pause. I sensed they were deciding how far to push, and I was deciding how firmly to stand. One afternoon I did something unexpected even to myself. I left the house alone and took the bus across town. It was a small act, but it felt enormous. I watched familiar streets pass by, places I had not visited in years. For the first time in a long while, I felt anonymous, free from watching eyes. I met someone who knew me before all of this. We talked for hours, remembering difficult times and impossible choices. They looked at me not with concern but with respect. That look stayed with me as I returned home. When I walked through the door, I could feel the shift immediately. Questions came quickly. Where had I gone? Why hadn't I said anything? I answered calmly. I said I needed to remind myself who I was. That evening, as I sat alone, I understood something deeply. Independence does not disappear with age. It only becomes quieter. And if I wanted to keep it, I would have to protect it deliberately, even from those who believed they knew what was best for me. My absence that afternoon changed the balance in the house. I could see it in their faces, in the way concern quickly turned into frustration. They had not expected me to act without permission. For years I had been predictable, easy to plan around. Now I was not. That evening the conversation returned, sharper than before. They spoke about trust, about safety, about how frightened they had been when they could not find me. I listened carefully, understanding their fear, but also recognizing how tightly it wrapped around control. Fear, I had learned, can sound a lot like love. I told them where I had gone and why. I said I needed space to think, to remember that I was still capable of moving through the world on my own. Some understood. Others did not. One voice said I was being reckless. Another said I was proving their point. The room filled with tension again, but I did not retreat. I asked them to imagine how it felt to be discussed, planned for, and redirected without being included. My words landed unevenly, but they landed. Later, alone in my room, I felt the weight of what I had started. This was no longer a quiet disagreement. It was a struggle over my place in this family. And for the first time, I did not wish for things to go back to the way they were. That version of peace had cost me too much. The next morning, something shifted again. The house was unusually quiet, not tense but thoughtful. People spoke more slowly, choosing words with care. I sensed that my absence and my honesty had forced them to reconsider, even if they were not ready to admit it. One of them approached me privately. Not with a plan, not with advice, but with a question. They asked how long I had been feeling this way. The simplicity of it surprised me. I answered truthfully. Longer than I had ever allowed myself to say out loud. We talked without interruptions, without defenses. For the first time I felt heard, not managed. It did not fix everything, but it opened a door that had been closed for a long time. Understanding does not arrive all at once. Sometimes it comes quietly, one person at a time. Later that day, I reflected on how easily fear can silence empathy. They had been so focused on protecting me that they had stopped seeing me. I understood their intentions better now, even as I held my ground. That evening, as I prepared for bed, I felt something unfamiliar but welcome: hope. Not the naive kind that expects everything to resolve quickly, but the steady kind that grows when truth is finally allowed into the room. Hope did not make things easy right away. The house still carried the weight of unresolved choices, but it softened the edges. There were fewer whispers, fewer closed doors. Small gestures appeared. A question asked before a decision, a pause where my answer was actually awaited. Still, not everyone accepted the change. One evening, frustration surfaced again. Someone said all this uncertainty was exhausting. That life would be simpler if things were decided once and for all. I listened, recognizing the familiar desire for control disguised as efficiency. I responded calmly. I said simplicity for some should not mean disappearance for others. The words surprised even me. They carried the strength of everything I had held back for years. The room grew quiet, not in resistance but in thought. Later, alone, I wondered how fragile families can be when roles shift. They had known how to love me when I was useful, when I held everything together. Now they were learning how to love me as I was independent, aging but still whole. That night, I slept more deeply than I had in weeks. Change was happening slowly, unevenly, but it was happening. And for the first time, I felt that my place in this family was being redefined, not erased. The realization came quietly, without drama. I was sitting at the kitchen table, watching the morning light fall across the floor, when I understood that this family was learning something new. Not how to care for me, but how to listen. It was an awkward lesson, full of mistakes, but it was real. They began to include me in conversations again, not out of obligation, but curiosity. They asked what I wanted to keep, what I was willing to change. Some questions were hesitant, others sincere. I answered honestly, even when my answers made them uncomfortable. I knew not everything would return to how it once was. Some trust had been stretched thin. Some words could not be taken back. But relationships, like people, evolve or break. We were choosing evolution, even if it was slow. That afternoon, I stood in the doorway of my home and felt something close to peace. Not because the future was certain, but because my voice was finally part of it. I had not won anything. I had simply claimed what should never have been taken from me. As the day ended, I thought about all the years I had spent protecting others from discomfort. I understood now that love does not mean erasing yourself. Sometimes it means standing firmly where you are and allowing others to meet you there. With that small sense of peace came something unexpected: responsibility. Once my voice returned to the room, I could no longer hide behind silence. I had to decide what I truly wanted, not just what I was resisting. That question stayed with me as I moved through the day, heavier than any argument. In the evening, I asked for another conversation. This time, the request did not surprise them. We sat together, not close, not distant, somewhere in between. I told them I wanted clear boundaries. I said I would accept help when I asked for it, not when it was decided for me. I watched their faces carefully as I spoke, searching for signs of understanding. Some nodded. Some looked uncertain. Change rarely arrives evenly. I reminded them that independence does not mean rejection. That needing space does not mean loving less. My words felt fragile but honest. Later, alone again, doubt returned quietly. Standing up is one thing. Staying standing is another. I wondered if I was strong enough to keep this balance, to defend my place without turning into someone bitter or distant. Aging teaches you many things, but courage must still be chosen daily. As I lay down to sleep, I made a quiet promise to myself. I would not retreat simply because it was easier. I had reclaimed my voice too late in life to give it up again now. The days that followed were calmer but not simple. Boundaries once spoken needed practice. I noticed moments when old habits tried to return. A decision made quickly, an assumption offered in my place. Each time I gently corrected it, not with anger but with presence. One afternoon someone asked me for advice. Not about me but about their own problem. The question caught me off guard. I answered carefully, realizing how long it had been since my experience had been valued instead of managed. That small exchange stayed with me longer than it should have. Still, I felt the strain underneath. Change demands effort from everyone, and not all effort is welcomed. There were looks that suggested impatience, silences that hinted at disagreement. I accepted them. Progress does not erase discomfort. It moves through it. That evening, I returned to the drawer I had opened weeks before. I looked again at the papers, the letters, the quiet proof of a life lived fully. I did not feel the need to hide them anymore. Whatever came next, I was ready to face it openly. As I closed the drawer, I felt steady. This was no longer about defending myself. It was about living honestly, even if that honesty unsettled the people I loved. I began to notice how our family rhythm slowly changed. Meals lasted longer. Conversations wandered instead of ending quickly. Sometimes my opinions were challenged, sometimes accepted, but they were no longer ignored. That alone felt like a quiet victory. One evening, someone admitted they had been afraid of losing me. Not in the way I feared, but in the way people fear change they cannot control. Hearing that softened something inside me. Fear had shaped many of our choices, not just theirs but mine as well. I told them something I had never said before. I said that being treated as fragile made me feel invisible. That love expressed only as protection can become a cage. The words were difficult but necessary. No one argued. They listened. Later, alone in my room, I thought about how easily silence can be mistaken for agreement. I had allowed that confusion to grow for too long. Speaking now did not erase the past, but it reshaped the future. I understood then that family is not about holding on tightly. It is about learning when to loosen your grip. And that lesson, like all important ones, had come late, but not too late. There was a quiet moment one morning that stayed with me. We were all in the kitchen, moving around each other without tension. Someone asked where I wanted to go that afternoon, not out of concern but interest. I answered without hesitation. No explanations were required. I realized then how different the air felt. Not lighter but fairer. Respect does not announce itself loudly. It shows up in small, ordinary moments. In being asked instead of told. In being trusted instead of watched. Later that day, I spent time alone in the house, really seeing it again. Not as something I needed to defend, but as a place I still belonged to. Whatever the future held, this space had not rejected me. People had. That evening, I thought about how close I had come to disappearing quietly. How easily my life could have been rearranged without my consent. The thought no longer filled me with fear, but with resolve. I understood now that my story was not about winning or losing. It was about remaining present in my own life. And that presence, once reclaimed, changed everything around it. The understanding settled into me slowly, like a final piece finding its place. Nothing dramatic marked the end of this chapter. No apologies spoken perfectly. No promises made forever. Life continued in its ordinary way, and that was enough. Ordinary no longer felt like erasure. I knew our family would never return to what it once was. Too much had been seen, too much said. But we had arrived at something more honest. They no longer spoke about my life as if it were fragile glass. And I no longer waited quietly for permission to exist. One evening, as I prepared for bed, I caught my reflection in the mirror. I looked older, yes, but also clearer. I saw a woman who had lived, endured, given, and finally claimed her place again. Not loudly, not angrily, simply firmly. I understood then that my silence had never been strength. My voice had been. I had just forgotten how to use it. Aging had not taken it from me. Fear had. As I turned off the light, I felt a calm I had not known in years. Whatever time I had left would be lived as mine. Not managed. Not decided for. Mine.